Welcome back, everybody, to another lecture here in History 1302. And today the topic that we'll be covering is that of the Reagan years, or better known as the Reagan Revolution. Now, when we've been in class the past few topics, we've talked about the 1960s and the 1970s, and we saw what was happening in the United States socially. We saw the rise of the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement, as well as the anti-war movements. But when we saw the rise of those movements, while they do promote more progressive and liberal ideals that we see today, what we're also going to see is that there is a rise of a conservative movement occurring at this very same moment. Now, I briefly touched upon this when we talked about the election of 1964, when Barry Goldwater is nominated to become the Republican nominee that year. But in that same year, giving a speech on behalf of Goldwater would be this figure, Ronald Reagan, a former actor from California, turned governor of California just a few years after that election, who would eventually come to epitomize what we would recognize today as a modern-day conservative. Now, Reagan himself, during the 1960s, 70s, and eventually once he gets to the presidency in the 1980s, is going to epitomize what conservatism is today. He's going to call for a weaker centralized government. He's going to call for the lowering of taxes, as well as a number of other reforms that we see characteristic of the Republican Party. Now, with Ronald Reagan, we do see that he does attempt to run for the presidency on numerous occasions, but eventually by 1980, he will get the Republican nomination. And he's going to form a true coalition of conservative forces during this particular election that have become the mainstay of the Republican Party even up to our present day. Now, within the before the election of 1980, he's going to bring a lot of conservatives into the fold in the Republican Party. He's going to appeal to conservative white former Democrats that we see from the South. He's going to appeal to the conservative religious wing that we see in the modern-day Republican Party. He's also going to appeal to libertarians, as well as a host of other conservative factions, and bring them into a coalition that will help lead him to the presidency in 1980. Piggybacking the message that he's basically going to promote in 1980 is, are you better off than you were 4 years before, alluding to what had happened during the course of the Carter administration. And he'd also promote to the American people that his resolution to the economic crisis would be to lower tariffs to get, or not tariffs, so to lower taxes to get more money and income into their pockets. And because really of the Iranian hostage crisis that we talked about last time in class, Jimmy Carter was probably not going to win this election anyways. But nonetheless, Ronald Reagan, off this message, he will come into the election in 1980, win handsomely, and take over as president in January of 1981. And over the course of the next 8 years, he's going to come to redefine how Americans view conservatism and redefine the platform of the Republican Party. Now, focusing first on the domestic policies of the Reagan administration and how they're going to come to define the modern-day Republican Party, let's take a look first at his economic policies that he's going to begin to implement. Now, his economic policies collectively have become known as Reaganomics, to where he would call for lower taxes as well as deregulation to try to get the American economy moving again. Now, by the beginning of the 1980s, we continued to see that America was suffering from the negative economic effects that we had seen during the 1970s. We continue to see that there was high inflation as well as high unemployment. And to attack this, Reagan is going to begin to lower taxes as well as begin to deregulate some of these industries. And this wasn't anything relatively new, because we did see some of these aspects, or at least policies, were put into place during the Carter administration. But we'll see that Reagan will come to champion this form of economic policies. Now, by lowering taxes as well as by deregulating the economy, what he was hoping to improve was investment within the U.S. economy, both from those at the top of the wealth chain as well as those at the bottom of the wealth chain. By lowering taxes, especially on the wealthy, which he would do in both his 1981 as well as his 1985 tax reforms, what we'll see is he would lower taxes on the wealthy, and the hope was that they would begin to invest more into American businesses to stop shifting jobs overseas. However, we'll see on many occasions that won't exactly be the case, but that was the thought process for Reagan. On top of that, if these individuals were willing to invest more into American jobs, the hope was that this would benefit Americans at the bottom end of the spectrum. On top of that, by lowering taxes, he was hoping to also benefit average Americans, because the hope was that if they didn't have to worry about paying so much in taxes, perhaps they'd be more willing to spend. And if they were more willing to spend, they could hopefully help fuel the American economy that way. Now, this has become known by those who would support Reagan as the supply-side economics and to those who oppose Reagan as the trickle-down effect. Now, for his economic policies, it kind of comes with a mixed baggage. We will see initially they're not going to be widely successful because in 1981 as well as to 1982, there will be an economic recession, the worst since the 1930s, when we see unemployment rise above about 10%. However, by the time we do get to the end of the Reagan administration, we will see that there will be vast economic growth, and on top of that, the inflation rate would go down from 13% following the beginning of the 1980s down to 3% at the end of the 1980s. So it went down substantially. But nonetheless, there are still many critics, and depending on what your political views are today, are going to be on how you view Reaganomics. Now, the aspect of Reaganomics and Reagan's economic policies aren't going to be the only thing that are going to characterize his domestic policies. Because we'll also see that while he had a conservative approach to economics, he's also going to have a conservative approach to some programs that had been established in the 1960s and the 1970s, especially in regards to affirmative action, to where he would begin to reduce much of those programs. We'd also see that he would begin to reduce funding into food stamps as well as to school lunches. However, while those are going to be characteristic of some conservative policies, we'll see that he's going to disappoint conservatives in other aspects, because he's not going to dismantle New Deal as well as Great Society programs, most notably that of Social Security as well as Medicare and Medicaid, as conservatives were hoping he would when he took over in office. Now, when Reagan implements these policies, we're also going to see that he's going to disappoint conservatives, because he will appoint the first female to the U.S. Supreme Court with Sandra Day O'Connor during the mid-1980s. And so in many aspects, he will promote some policies that will both encourage conservatives but also discourage them at the same time. Now, there is one aspect of the Reagan administration I wanted to touch upon that both conservatives and liberals often don't look at when talking about the Reagan administration today, and that's in regards to his immigration policies. So touching on Reagan's immigration policy really quick, what he's going to be noteworthy for is going to be a policy that he'll push through Congress in 1986, known as the Immigration Reform and Control Act. Now, this is something that's going to fall out of line with what we see characteristic of Republican immigration policy up to date, because we'll see, unlike the Republican policies of today, Reagan's going to promote this Reform Act and grant amnesty to over 3 million undocumented immigrants that were living in the United States in 1986. The reason he does this is because he argues that they were crucial to American economic growth and that he wants to live up to the ideals of America being the safe haven for immigrants. And we'll see there will be other clauses associated with this Reform Act that would help strengthen the U.S. southern border, but this will be something that's uncharacteristic with what we see with the modern-day Republican Party. And oftentimes, both conservatives as well as liberals today don't talk about his immigration policy whenever they talk about the Reagan administration, because it doesn't firmly fit into their agenda. Because in regards to liberals, they would be praising him, something they don't want to do since he's the poster child of modern-day conservatism, and conservatives, on the other hand, don't want to acknowledge this immigration policy because it doesn't fall in line with their own views. Now, further diving into his domestic policies, alongside immigration, what I also want to talk about is an epidemic that he's going to have to confront during his administration. Because during the early 1980s, we will see the outbreak of the AIDS epidemic that will come to grip the nation. However, Reagan at first is going to largely ignore it. Now, AIDS, or acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, it's going to become prevalent by the early 1980s. However, it's going to be a virus that not a lot of people are going to know a whole lot about. However, by about 1983 or so, what we will see is that it will become prevalent, especially amongst the LGBTQ community. And Reagan himself isn't going to address this epidemic immediately, especially because he was trying to compromise, if we remember, with that Christian right that we see associated with the conservative movement. And many believe that the AIDS epidemic, especially from the Christian right, was a righteous kind of virus that was beginning to target the growing gay rights movement. However, we will eventually see that with the growing epidemic with AIDS, by 1985, Reagan would issue a response, and by 1987, he would then interject over $500 million to begin to develop some sort of response to this epidemic. However, nonetheless, we'll see it will take him time, and hundreds of thousands of people are going to die as a result of this disease before we see that it brings about any sort of action. But anyways, moving on from that, we've talked about his domestic policy so far, but that's not going to be the only thing that's going to characterize the Reagan administration. Now let's shift our focus over to what was occurring out on the world stage, especially in regards to foreign affairs. Because as we'll see, the Cold War, it was still raging during the 1980s, and there was a threat that perhaps we could come to nuclear war when Reagan first takes office. So let's take a look at his Cold War policies and how they're going to differ from the 1970s and how they're going to reinvigorate the Cold War, at least during his first presidential term. Now, shifting our focus from Reagan's domestic policies, let's now start talking about his Cold War policies. Now, the Cold War itself, he's going to inherit it from the previous presidents that we'd seen in place, but during the 1970s, we saw through the détente policies, both during the Nixon, Ford, as well as Carter administrations, we started to see that the Cold War began to kind of disintegrate. However, with the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the Cold War would once again threaten to turn hot. And when Reagan takes over the presidency, all throughout the election of 1980, he's going to campaign on a harsher form of the Cold policy. He's going to campaign that he wants to ensure that there would be an increase in military spending, that he would increase the number of nuclear weapons within the U.S. arsenal to confront the Soviets on the world stage, to strengthen America's military might on the world stage. And that's something that's going to highlight his administration during the 1980s. He will increase military spending and live up to the expectation that he was a Cold Warrior, that he was a staunch anti-communist. However, by increasing military spending, as well as in convincing the Western powers that were involved in NATO to install short-range ballistic missiles over in Western Europe, this is going to lead to a rise in tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the early 1980s. And on one occasion, during 1983, the world was on the verge of a nuclear war, when we do see that a war games is going to be held by the Western powers, but it would be seen as so real that the Soviets were beginning to scramble to perhaps send in fighters as well as missiles into action. However, when we do see that his rhetoric nearly leads to the outbreak of a nuclear war, the second term that he has in office, it's going to be characterized by a thawing of the Cold War to try to improve relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. And a large reason for that will be because the Soviet Union is going to gain a new premier who's going to promote a more reform-minded policies, so that way it could bring the Soviet Union up to scale with the United States and begin to hopefully ease tensions within the Cold War. Now, really quick, something that I forgot to mention in regards to his first-term Cold War policies that demonstrate that Reagan was a Cold Warrior, that he was a staunch anti-communist. We'll also see that he's going to implement what's known as a Strategic Defense Initiative, or better known as Star Wars, to where he would call for the use of satellites to intercept ballistic missiles that could have perhaps be fired by the Soviet Union in regards to their defense. However, with this initiative, what we will see is it's going to call for the using of lasers to shoot those things down, but by this time, technology was nowhere even near that. And so we'll see that it would be unfeasible. But nonetheless, by the time we get to 1983 and 1984, tensions within the Cold War were at its peak. However, by 1985, after Reagan has won re-election and takes office for a second presidential term, we'll see that the Soviet Union is going to gain a new premier, and that of Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, Gorbachev himself is going to look to be a reformist. He's going to look to open the country economically as well as politically to promote openness. And by doing so, especially since the first half of Reagan's administration have been characterized by a rise in tensions, because of a more open-minded premier within the Soviet Union, we'll start to see that tensions begin to ease. And in 1986 and 1987, we'll see that Gorbachev and Reagan would meet on several occasions, and they would slowly begin to not necessarily denuclearize, but they would begin to reduce the amount, I guess it would be denuclearize their respective arsenals, and they would begin to resolve tensions between their two powers. And by the time we get to the end of the 1980s, the Cold War was virtually on an end. And Reagan will be characterized as the president that brings about the end of the Cold War, because shortly after his administration goes out of office, because of his military spending as well as a number of other reasons, the Soviet economy will collapse, and we'll see the Soviet Union would follow shortly thereafterwards. But he will be remembered for these Cold War policies when thinking about his foreign policies, but this isn't going to be the only thing that Reagan's going to do on the world stage, because we'll see that in regards to not only his Cold War policies, but in foreign policies, he's going to continue a tradition that we've seen ever since the beginning of the 20th century of getting involved in Latin American affairs to promote friendly regimes. However, by doing so, this could perhaps lead to the undoing of his administration and lead to the breakout of a major scandal that could perhaps tarnish his reputation. Now, in regards to his foreign policy excluding the Soviet Union, what we'll see is Reagan is going to continue the long-standing tradition of supporting anti-communist regimes that we see throughout Latin America as well as throughout the world. See that he would involve the CIA as well as involves government spending into some of these regimes, but the most noteworthy that I'm going to point out is going to be that of the Contras. Now, the Contras are going to be down in Nicaragua, where they would be fighting against a socialist regime, and we'll see that at first Reagan was sympathetic towards the Contras, wanting to bring in military spending and funding into that regime. However, by the mid-1980s, we'll see that Congress is going to pass an act to where Reagan will not be able to do such. However, he's going to try, or I should say members of his administration are going to try to get that funding to that anti-communist regime through another arms deal. Now, this is where we'll see the state of Iran is going to come into play. By this time, we continue to see that there was unrest within the Middle East. By this point, we see that Iran was fighting a war with their neighbor, Iraq. And by the middle of the 1980s, Iran was very much losing that conflict. And behind closed doors, Iran, who was still technically considered an enemy to the United States, will actually try to open up negotiations with the U.S. to bring about an arms deal to where they could begin to import necessary arms into their arsenal to combat the Iraqis. However, because of an embargo that had been placed on Iran, the United States would not sell any arms deals. However, a part of several different motives, we'll see that Ronald Reagan is actually going to support sending over arms to Iran secretly. And largely it will be because Iran, a major power within the Middle East at this point, and a supporter of the terrorists that we see funded in Lebanon who had attacked U.S. Marines as well as taken a number of captives during the Reagan administration, he was hoping that if he provided some sort of arms to Iran, they would put pressure on Lebanon to release those hostages and return them back to the United States. Well, through this policy, we'll see that members of his administration are also going to take some of that funding and some of those arms that were being sent to Iran and divert them over to the Contras. And what will result is the Iran-Contra affair. Very similar to Watergate, we'll see during the latter portion of the Reagan administration, it would start to be heavily reported on, and there'd be Senate hearings. And eventually, we'll see after a committee had been formed to see whether or not the president was involved, it was very unclear whether or not he knew directly of this affair. However, the Iran-Contra affair will tarnish some of Reagan's reputation as he leaves office in 1988, especially as we see, I believe it's about 11 individuals who would ultimately have charges brought up against them. But it will be the next president, George H.W. Bush, who will pardon 6 of those individuals, and many of them high members within Reagan's administration. But by 1988, even with the Iran-Contra affair, with this scandal perhaps rocking the Reagan administration, he will leave office on a relatively popular note. And we see that in the election of 1988 because his vice president, George H.W. Bush, is going to easily win the election that year, continuing hopefully the policies of the Reagan administration. However, that's a topic for a future lecture, but we're going to go ahead and we'll end on that note with the Reagan administration and the Reagan years. But anyways, before we end this lecture, just like always, make sure that you complete all assignments, view all topics, as well as read all the required readings for this week. If you do have any questions in the meantime, you know you can reach out to me, but otherwise everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see everybody in the next video.